The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, why are Ontario unions split on which party has the best interests of the labour movement at heart? Then, New Democrat MP Charlie Angus on his new book about the decade of excess that was the 1980s. That's all next on The Agenda. It used to be a truism in Ontario politics that the Liberals and New Democrats would fight over endorsements from organized labour, while the Conservatives stood on the sidelines. Those days are gone. The Ontario election campaign is just 1 week old, and Doug Ford's Tories have already received several union endorsements. Not only that, Ford kicked off his campaign in Windsor, which had previously never been Tory territory. What's going on here? Let's find out from J.P. Hornick, president of OPSU, the 180,000-person strong Ontario Public Service Employees Union. Karen Brown, president of ETFO, the 83,000-person strong Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario. Victoria Mancinelli, director of communications at LIUNA, the 80,000-person strong Labourers International Union of North America. And Jeff Gray, Queen's Park reporter for the 1,000-person strong Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper. And it's great to have everybody around our table tonight for, I think, a pretty timely discussion about what's going on out there in the world of organized labor. Victoria, I want to start with you. Your union endorsed Doug Ford.
We did, again.
How come?
Well, we feel that this government has really stepped up for our workers. We have never in the history of Ontario seen this level of dedication and commitment to advancing skilled trades and apprenticeship pathways like we have with the Doug Ford government, and building those collaborative efforts with the Minister of Labour as well. So we now have 120,000 members across Ontario, predominantly in the construction sector, and they have seen great benefits of investing in their potential, investing in their futures, and investing in their careers.
JP, have you made a decision at your union to endorse one of the parties in this election?
We don't have an affiliation with any of the parties, but we do have a policy where we endorse NDP candidates. What I will say, though, to Victoria's point about the endorsement of LIUNA or construction unions, what we're seeing is actually sort of, individual endorsements of Doug Ford and the Tories, and that is noteworthy only because it's so rare. Most of the unions actually don't endorse the Conservatives, and, I think we'll have a discussion later on, hopefully, about his record versus what he says.
That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
Okay, but you don't, as a union, intend to endorse anybody?
We're not in the business of endorsements, but we are actually supporting NDP candidates across the province.
Okay. How about for you, Karen? Do you intend to endorse one of the political parties during this campaign?
We're not going to be doing that. I mean, in the past, we have endorsed a particular party, but our members want us to kind of lead them in the direction in regards to the party's track records. Our locals, however, are going to be looking at candidates in their writing, providing endorsements, and we're going to perhaps amplify those endorsements. So it's not a blanket, it's who's serving in communities and whose platforms best provide the quality public education our members are looking for.
Are there any circumstances under which you would consider endorsing the Progressive Conservatives in this campaign?
From what we've heard from our members, resoundingly, they have failed in public education under their 6 years of leadership. Our members have suffered with larger class sizes, increased violence, the constant underfunding, and we'll get into that more. But right now, our members are saying they're not a government that has prioritized public education.
How about public service in general?
Not. No.
So there's no way you would endorse Ford?
No, and similarly, our locals are going to be endorsing, different candidates, and certainly will be doing so in different ridings. And we believe that, the NDP is the workers' party. Certainly, their promises around investments in public education, the colleges, healthcare, these are the things that our people are concerned about. But under Doug Ford, we've lost 200,000 jobs over the past 7 years. Our GDP peaked in 2017 and hasn't recovered since. We're looking at historic and chronic underfunding of every public service. And I think worse than that, Steve, we're looking at a deliberate effort to starve the public services to pave the way for privatization. So we're seeing an expansiveness of privatization or an expanding of privatization at the very time that we need direct investments in those services that will actually provide for construction workers, that will provide for the future of Ontario.
Here's where I need a good analyst to come in here and point out that Karen and JP represent public service unions. Victoria represents a private sector union. That's not a coincidence, I presume.
Yeah, I mean, I think the PCs have made they've really made a transformation. They have made this appeal. I dismissed it at first, actually, as sort of showmanship, but they did a bunch of things behind the scenes and in front of the cameras, particularly with the former Labour Minister, Monty McNaughton, who we were talking about before. And they have appealed to, I think it goes beyond just things to appeal to unions or union leadership in the construction trades. And I mean, we've now seen a couple of Unifor locals, auto workers, auto parts workers endorse the governing party as well. It actually also is part of Doug Ford's brand, really, to appeal to. So I think it goes beyond. It goes beyond appealing to union. If you ask them, have you made it easier to join a union? Have you made unions more powerful? The answer, of course, is no. But they've done other smaller things that have appealed to union leaders, but have also allowed them to present themselves as on the side of, many laborers, workers, construction workers, many of whom are not unionized too, right? People who, the working class is what we used to. The term we used to use, that has been part of their appeal, and it's been deliberate and it's been strategic, and look at the poll numbers. It seems to be working.
Can you just tell us, Victoria, how you came to endorse Ford and you did in the last election too, right? And this one.
Yes.
How did that happen?
So Leon is not beholden to any party. We will always work with candidates, premiers, parties across all different party lines if they're willing to show up and work for our members. We represent members not only in the construction industry, but also in the industrial sector as well. And so there's a split there between the NDP and Conservatives. But when we are working with the government, we want them to show up day in, day out, the same way our members show up day in, day out to build the province. We have seen a historic investment in skilled trades. We have $200 billion being invested in infrastructure, matched by $2.5 billion in skilled trades. We've never seen that level of investment in Ontario in skilled trades and apprenticeship pathways. So when we're working with the government, we want to prioritize policy that, of course, impacts our members and their families and is investing in their jobs, and that's the Doug Ford government.
I'm just trying to think, though, how this do they approach you and say, we'd love your endorsement, or do you call them and say, we want to? How does it work?
No, it's relationship building. It has to be proven. Nothing's ever going to be handed out on either side. We have to gain trust, and it has to be a genuine collaboration. And a lot of that stemmed from the former Minister of Labour, which is Monty McNaughton. There was a lot of learning and building that had to come from him when he was our Labour Minister, and he really paved a really strong foundation where we saw workers and unions leaving the left and moving toward the Ford government.
I'll just jump in there,
Please.
because that's really some of my concern, because education, we were trying to reach out to the former Minister for Education to establish those relationships, to talk about the issues in public education as a key stakeholder, and they refused to meet with us. We never had an opportunity. Stephen Lecce. I met with him a week before he changed position, and so they had how many years in office to actually address our concerns, and they didn't. We were open. We have been stakeholders in education for decades. EDFO has been a leader in education, and we know what the issues are in regards to class size. We know about the long wait list for special education, the children that are suffering. We know about the mental health crisis. We know about the teacher shortage that's happening now. We know that there's 40,000 people in the province of Ontario that have a teaching certificate that are not teaching because of the undesirable working conditions. This government, we saw $1,500 less per pupil funding since 1998. So
is that in absolute terms or after inflation?
After inflation. With inflation put into the mix. And so we don't see that willingness, and they shouldn't be just cherry picking who they're meeting with. We are key stakeholders. Public education is the foundation. We're working with the children of your workers who are going to eventually go into the skilled trades. So we need to work on the foundations, and we're saying this government has failed in that opportunity.
Jeff.
And you're seeing it right there. So the government did this outreach to these private sector unions, construction unions, but it also at the same time did a whole bunch of things that were really got up people's noses on the public sector union side in particular. Although at one point he got everybody.
We remember
go
that
through
day
some
when-
of that. So I mean, they limited public sector wage increases to 1% across the board, even in the face of what came later, which was a pandemic, and we were losing nurses and everything. And then they tried to use the notwithstanding clause in the Constitution to force a contract on an education union and deny them the right to strike. So that got the whole labor movement upset, and eventually government backed down on that. Actually, not eventually, fairly quickly, the government backed down on
There was
that.
what, like 15 or 20 union leaders at one single press conference all saying, Premier,
Yeah.
you've overreached.
So you have had this sort of two-faced kind of approach to it, haven't you? We've had,
JP, can I just get your view on what you think when you, and it's happened with some degree of regularity, even though we're only a week into the campaign so far, when you see the Premier with unionized workers, often in the backdrop, getting the endorsement going?
Well, listen, there's a couple of things on that. And one, I'm not going to, fault any union for wanting to protect their workers or their industry. I think that is, absolutely something that unions are supposed to do. What we're all tasked with is to protect our members, but to also contribute to the Ontario economy. So I understand where they're coming from. But I would also say that we're being sold a bill of goods. This guy is, he's equivalent in the States. We would say, I've got a bridge I can sell you. Up here, it's a tunnel under the 401, right? Because when you're listening to his rhetoric, it's one thing. But I was raised on the notion that you don't just listen to what someone says, you watch what they do. And when I look at what Doug Ford is doing, his rhetoric is great for some workers, 90% of whom are men. Right? We used to just call that sexism or misogyny. But when you look at the public service, when you look at healthcare, when you look at education, when you look at housing starts, he is failing on every single promise that he is making except putting beer in corner stores, right? We look at the Ontario Science Centre. He shuts out within a day. He's setting us back at least a decade on science education, particularly in poorer communities. You look at the Therme Spa. He's going to spend $2 billion of taxpayer money on that for a handful of Ontarians who are wealthy enough to enjoy it. He's willing to spend tens of billions of dollars on a tunnel that nobody needs and that he doesn't even know what it would cost at the end of the day. And he's not delivering on the promises that are making our economy more affordable for your everyday Ontarian. You got people in Walkerton lining up at 2 a.m., 2.5 million people without a family doctor. But sure, he's good for some sectors. In theory. In practice, we need to see what his record actually looks like. And I'm glad that they can get a meeting with him. We certainly can't. And I got to say, our members are the driving force of the Ontario economy.
Victoria, does none of that trouble you?
Sure. I mean, I would agree that I think our job as union representatives is to first and foremost represent our members and their interests, and that is exactly what we are doing. And when we go back to the notwithstanding clause, LUNA was the first one to issue a letter to Minister Lecce at that time, and that didn't impact our members, but we stood together in solidarity, which we didn't see when the Wynne government was attacking LUNA's collective bargaining, but that's neither here or there. But when it comes to saying, again, that construction's just male-dominated, it's not. We are working so hard to get more women in the industry, and I feel like all that work is just being discredited to make a talking point. We're seeing a 30% increase in apprenticeship registrations in women in Ontario. So construction industry is not just men. Second of all, I think there are concerns when it comes to education in our healthcare sector, and I think the province should be doing a better job of meeting with stakeholders so that way we can find a collaboration to move forward together. Because we know when all of these sectors are strong, our economy is strong and we can move forward and build a prosperous future for Ontario. But for us, it's not just rhetoric. They're proving it. It's action.
Okay, those numbers notwithstanding, and you're right, the numbers of female participation in your sector are definitely improving. There's no question. It's an empirically provable fact. Having said that, I think JP's assertion is also an empirically provable fact. Doug Ford does seem to have, Jeff, maybe you could weigh in on this, he does seem to have more endorsements and better relationships with unions that are, let's call them male-dominated, as opposed to the professions which tend to be female-dominated, nurses, teachers, etc. I mean, that's a fair observation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that split between public sector and private sector unions. I think that's what's part of that. And to your point, I mean, there have been there are more women in the trades, and the government actually has been trying to help with that. One of the little things they did a bunch of little things. They did some bigger things. Little things like rules around you have to have clean washrooms, on work sites. These things seem like no-brainers, but they actually seem to have made a difference, and people appreciate that. Also, the minimum wage, another thing that the government has actually indexed the minimum wage to inflation. So you definitely have that split between the two sides of the union movement, both between themselves and with the way the government has been responding to them.
But Karen, are you prepared to go as far as JP and say that this government is demonstrating under Ford's leadership a misogyny in the way that it's differentiating between how it treats unions?
Well, when you look at education unions, or at least ETFO is 80% women. When we look at the healthcare sector, which is predominantly women, and when a premier says we should, for education, stick to our knitting, I think that is a bit of misogyny in regards to that. Stay in our lane and stick to knitting. It's an insult to our professionalism. It's an insult to the work that we do as educators. And our issues are not at the forefront, and we're not getting the attention that we do need. And we are the caretakers in a sense of the children that are in our classrooms who are going to be the future of Ontario. And so the investments that this government should be making in early childhood education, as I said, we have over 27,000 children, according to the People for Education, who are on the wait list for autism services and other services. And so that's a failure of this particular government. What are they doing? We know that the level of violence continues to escalate in schools. What are they doing about that? And so we're seeing a rise in class sizes. Parents are putting their children in alternative programs outside of public education because the resources and the funding is not there. The wait list is not there. People are suffering. And it's important that we see those investments in public education. And this government has not been committed to it. It's been committed to other things, but we're also saying we need a government that's committed to good public services. Because the students that come in our classrooms, their parents are the ones that are in construction. They're the parents who are going to access the healthcare system that's failing and the housing that they can't get. We're looking at food insecurities. They don't need beer at the corner store, a buck of beer. They need to have housing and rent affordable so that they can have somewhere to live, that they're not being moved from here to there. In the classroom, our members are seeing the day-to-day impacts, and this government has failed to address those concerns that impact every Ontarian, not just a few.
Victoria, what's your take on the suggestion that the Ford government has demonstrated a kind of misogyny in the way that it prefers unions that are male-dominated versus those that are female-dominated?
I disagree. I can't speak for the public sector. I can only speak for ours, but I would disagree because I've seen a level of dedication to working to advance women in skilled trades, and that is what I'm going to judge them on.
Once upon a time, I think it's fair to say, many construction workers would have been very comfortable voting NDP. They did back in the day. Not so much anymore. What are you not hearing from the NDP that you perhaps might have heard once upon a time that's not allowing you to feel more comfortable endorsing them?
I think we're stuck in this ideologue kind of way of thinking when it comes to the NDP being the workers' party, not allowing that to transition and kind of open the doors to working with other parties as well. You know, a union endorsing a conservative shouldn't be this big cause for concern or nefarious or anything that's going on online on social media if you read some of the comments. It's working with parties and candidates that work on behalf of your members. LiUNA was never a big proponent of the NDP. We've found that a lot of the times they're anti-development, which hurts our members, anti-infrastructure, we're still seeing it today, anti-investing in our workers. Anytime the Ford government makes an announcement regarding skilled trades, it's corruption, it's rich buddies. Those are our members. Those are our members that show up every day. So it's not that they've left the NDP. They strongly feel that the NDP have left them.
JP, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair comment to say that many of the political parties have lost their ability to connect with the working class and with the workers' movement. You know, my role as an elected union leader, while it's to represent my members, I feel like we're participating in something much larger, which is trying to build that solidarity, to engage in these types of conversations. Huge fan of clean washrooms. Come from a college that, you know, has done a lot of work on building women in trades, for example, and I applaud that work. But what I worry about is that larger conversation conversation that needs to happen about the choices they're making around funding, right? So this is a government that has systematically underfunded the trades in colleges, right? And that has stripped money out of those communities.
But more to the question, what is the NDP not saying today that has enabled many people who work in construction to say, they don't represent me and my interests in the way that they used to?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question. So what we're looking at with the NDP is that message is not getting out there. It's not that they're not saying it. It's also that it's not being heard. And I think that we have a lot of work to do both within the labor movement in supporting the NDP and getting out in the community and connecting with workers in ways that matter and ensuring that those messages get heard. Because we do have a party that is committed to policy changes on all the right things. We have a party that was committed to working with the Ford government on, the threat of tariffs when it existed in the immediate. Everybody came together and said, we'll be willing to work together around the pandemic. Everybody's working together. But in this moment, rather than continuing that work, this government, with 15 months left in its mandate, called it unnecessary snap election in order to shore up their own power. And I think this is an opportunity where we can say, okay, if we're going out to vote, let's talk about policy. Let's talk about the party's platforms, and let's talk about why the Conservatives are more interested in shoring up one man's job than dealing with the threat to 500,000. Mm-hmm.
I've been to a lot of your conventions in the past. Not as many as you, but I've been to a lot of them. And, I think it's fair to say that when a Conservative politician shows up, they don't get quite the nice reaction than, say, the leader of the NDP gets when he or she shows up to give a speech. And yet, we're seeing more unions nowadays endorsing the Conservatives. What are you not hearing from the NDP that would enable more of your members to support them?
I don't think our members are not in position to not support the NDP. Basically, what we know is that the NDP, the Liberal and the Green parties, have actually consulted with us in regards to our education platform. So we've shared information, and we're optimistic that we'll be seeing some of that information and that input in their platforms. The PC government hasn't come to us, hasn't said, hey, let's talk about education. What should we be incorporating to have a good public education system? They don't have an education platform. So we're not a priority, and that's a concern for our members. There has nothing been rolled out by the PC in regards to what is their plan to succeed, to help the students of Ontario, to help the educators of Ontario create a great system. And that's where they're failing our members, and that's what we need to see. We have not seen that from them. The other parties are committed to dialogue and are committed to putting our input in regards to class size, specialist teachers, the supports that are needed so students can thrive. That is failing and lacking from this PC government, and our members are saying, why should we vote for them? They're not investing in us, but yet they want to hold us accountable when the system is failing, when students aren't doing well. That's a shortfall.
I just want to point, I think we should also make the distinction between union leadership and union members. Political scientists will tell you that union membership is not actually a great predictor of how people will vote. So there's all sorts of people who support all different political views. These are very large. Union endorsements get you activists and some help.
It's supposed to get you a lot of boots on the ground.
Boots on the ground.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always translate into one-to-one votes. The other thing, of course, that has happened in Ontario is when we talk about the NDP, you have to talk about Bob Rae and the social contract and the sort of the detachment of the labor movement in many cases from a formal automatic link to the NDP because of that rupture.
I should just say,
you're not old enough to remember it.
Well, I was just going to say that was 35 years ago, and for our younger viewers who don't know what that's all about, when the NDP were in power from 1990 to 95, they brought in what they called the social contract, which forced people who had collective agreements to, it allowed the government to unilaterally open those collective agreements and, I guess, deny people, what was it, 10 days or something like that? Make them work.
The Rae days.
Rae days. They were frozen.
But the idea was to save tens of thousands of people from having to be laid off in the face of the worst recession since the Great Depression. So that was the social contract. And are we saying that the NDP still has a problem with organized labor 35 years later because of that?
Well, I think, and of course I would defer to all the union leaders you have here rather than the journalist, the mere reporter here. But what you did see, I think, over the ensuing decades is a sort of more transactional approach to politics on the part of most of many labor unions. So what can you do for me? And often what you can do for me was an answer. The NDP had that answer. But as we've seen in the current situation, that's not always the case.
Can I ask you, are public servants still mad at the NDP for the social contract of 35 years ago?
Oh yeah, I mean it's a wound that
Yes,
still
they
rubs
are.
raw. There's some that are, but I would say that, like, frankly, the big lesson that we should take away from that is that it's not ever about E-Day. It's not about the election. It's about everything that happens afterward. No matter what government is elected, if there's anything we learned from that moment, is that we have to remain in solidarity, we have to remain in conversation, and we have to pressure whatever politician of whatever stripe is in power to do the right thing for workers. So what I think happened there was why you see the PCs being able to make the inroads that they have. I wouldn't say the entire private sector is on board, though. If you look at the press conference for the OFL had a week ago, we had 30 union leaders out there from private, public, and trades. Now, that said, you know, as Jeff pointed out, it's the locals that are doing these endorsements. It's not, you know, broad-scale unions outside of LUNA necessarily. And so what we're looking at here is the workers on the ground are looking for something else. And it is our job, whether we're union leaders or politicians, to figure out how to reach those folks, develop policy and consultation. Our experience is the same as Karen's. This government has not reached out to have a conversation, even though we are their largest group of employees.
Well, just to amplify what you were just saying, yes, Unifor, which was, Unifor is the creation, remind me here, of what unions in the past that all came together? It was the Canadian Auto Workers.
And CEP,
And
Canadian Communication and Energy Professionals.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So they came together, created Unifor, and a local of Unifor endorsed Doug Ford, well, at some point this past week. And we just want to say, in the interest of full disclosure, the people taking our pictures right now are represented by Unifor. Jeff is represented by Unifor as well. The public sector unions almost uniformly are against Ford, with one significant exception this past week. And that took place in Etobicoke North, which is Doug Ford's riding, and we've got a clip of that. Sheldon Osmond, our director, if you would, let's hear from the firefighters and the Premier. Roll it.
I'm honored to have the endorsement of the Ontario Professional Firefighter Association. Their first endorsement in nearly 15 years, and their first endorsement ever of our PC team. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate it.
That's a public sector union endorsing the Conservatives. What do you make of it?
Can I just say two things about that?
Sure.
Okay, I represent the wildland firefighters in Ontario, and they would not make that endorsement. So because Doug Ford has systematically not negotiated in good faith with them and given them what they need. But I would also say the clip that you didn't play out of that was where he also endorsed Donald Trump and wished he, you know, was hoping that he would be president right out of the gate.
I think that commercial's had a lot of play in the last couple of days.
You know, it's worth saying again that this is a guy that when the mic is on is saying one thing, and when he thinks the mic is off is back there saying another. And this is what I mean. Watch what he does, not what he says. So we'll see what happens with those firefighters. That's great, the professional firefighters. You're talking about one small group. When you're talking about Unifor, you're not talking about Unifor as a union. You're talking about individual locals. And one of the beautiful parts of unions is that we are democracies, which means that our locals often have an autonomy, that they're able to say things that we would not say as a union in its entirety. I love that my members have different opinions. My job is to try and remind them of who is supporting their rights on the ground and instituting policy and legislation that will ensure their jobs are secure on the go forward.
Victoria, I mean, we should talk about it for a moment here since it has come out. There was the Premier getting caught on a quote-unquote hot mic just the other day in which he said he was 100% supportive and happy about the fact that Trump had won. He's described himself in the past as being very supportive of the Republican Party in the States. However, the next line also was, and yet this guy effed me by sticking a knife in me. Yeah. So he did say that as well. I wonder, how troubled would your members be about the fact that the Premier, who in front of the mic is taking Trump on, but behind the scenes, we know, they're both populist politicians.
I mean, his personal politics is his personal politics. I think the way that he is stepping up to lead Ontario and a Team Canada while our federal government is really nowhere to be found is commendable. And so that is what I am looking at, is what he's doing every day to stand up to protect Ontario jobs and protect us against the threat of terrorists, invest in our energy sector that has been left derelict by previous governments as well. And when we go back to the NDP, I think a big fault on their part is still their stance on our nuclear energy and all of the jobs that they would create there. So again, a disconnect between our members and the NDP. But his personal politics, okay, he said that, followed up quickly by, and he stabbed me in the back. And that's what I think is missing, right? They like that hot mic moment, but I'm going to be judging the Premier on what he's willing to do to step up for Ontario against Trump.
Jeff, is the hot mic thing?
The hot mic thing, 2 points. One is, I mean, this gets a bit away from the union issue, but the fact that the Premier of Ontario, who has taken on this Captain Canada kind of mantle, fighting so vigorously against the threat of tariffs and all the stuff he said about the president, that as recently as this fall, when the president won the election, the Premier was still a fan of Donald Trump, even though we know so much about Donald Trump. January 6th, the criminal convictions, the threat of this kind of thing, the tariffs, was already on the so we. So let's put that in a box for a minute. The point that was kind of creeping into my brain there while everyone else was talking was when you mentioned Trump, look at the United States and look at the unions, the large unions in the United States that had members that were supporting Trump, but the leadership was caught kind of between wanting to endorse Harris or didn't endorse as strongly as they might have.
The leadership wanted to endorse the Democrats, but the members were for Trump.
Right. You have that dynamic happening. When you mentioned Trump, that's immediately what came into my mind. Separate from the politics of this hot mic moment, which may or may not impact the campaign as we go forward, as people point out the contradiction between the Premier's previous support for Donald Trump and what he's been saying lately.
We got a few minutes left here. Let me put one more item on the table, and that is, we've had this conversation. Certainly the last American presidential election was overwhelmingly focused on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It became a huge issue in the campaign, and quite a disconnect between, for example, much of the leadership of the Democratic Party and then what you might call ordinary Americans who, for a bunch of different reasons, are not enamored with the policy. Is that playing out, Karen, up here in the union movement?
First of all, I want to go back a bit before I answer that. I'm actually disappointed that the Premier would be outwardly supporting Trump, and that's the kind of leadership that he thinks that Ontarians want.
Well, he wasn't outwardly supporting him. He was privately supporting him.
Privately, but
he got caught supporting him.
Caught supporting him. That's the kind of leadership that Ontarians would even want to see us aspired. We pride ourselves on equity and diversity. When members of designated groups, when our members of our LGBTQ community basically can't enter the United States if you identify on your passport with an X. There are some things that we value as Ontarians that we would hope that our Premier would privately or publicly be supporting. As educators, we try to create safe and inclusive schools and environments for our students to thrive in. So when we're talking about what's happening here, we're seeing people feeling a pushback and feeling empowered to push back up in regards to the progress we've made around equity. And that's not the way we want to go. That's not the Canada we have strived for, being inclusive and having as many voices, because we're stronger in our diversity. And what we're seeing there is people being scapegoat for things that are happening and going back to a time, a very colonial time, a time where many people who are now in Canada wouldn't be welcomed. And I don't think that's good for the Ontario that we're trying to build. And I think unions in general are trying to push back. There are some unions who are not looking at the bigger picture, and we need to look at that bigger picture. We are asking our members to look at the platform of the NDP, look at the platforms of the Liberal, look at the platforms of the Green P, look at the platforms of progressive Conservatives, who are looking at things like healthcare, housing, affordable housing, education, things that are important to you, that are important to build a strong Ontario. And what has been the track record of those governments towards making that happen? We don't see that with the progressive Conservatives. And I think our union members need to be looking at that, not just their own working environments, but because we don't live in silos. It's going to impact our neighbors and everyone else.
J.P. Hornick from OPSU, Victoria Mancinelli from Liuna, as her dad calls it, or Liuna, as you call it. Karen Brown from EDFO and Jeff Gray of the Globe and Mail on the other side of the table. Thanks, everybody, for coming into TVO tonight. We're grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Those of a certain vintage might remember Michael Douglas's iconic line from the Oliver Stone film Wall Street. Douglas played Gordon Gekko, said greed is good, and essentially represented the spirit of the 1980s. But it was also a time of resistance, creativity, and hope, according to our next guest. Timmins James Bay MP Charlie Angus documents it all in his new book. It's called Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed. And we're pleased that it brings Charlie back to our studio today. Good to see you again.
Well, thanks so much for having me and talking about the book.
Let's start with a quote from the book, shall we? Sheldon Osmond, our director, bring up this quote if you would. Whether it's the economy and rising labor unrest or nuclear brinkmanship and a new Cold War, the 2020s feel like an 80s redux. The obsession with the 80s isn't new. There has long been a superficial fixation on the era. All right, let's start there. Why?
It's interesting, you know, I think all of us and people who lived through the 80s, we have this sort of cultural memory of big hair and those earworm songs that we just can't get out of our heads and the parachute pants. But when you start thinking about it, I mean, this was an era that led to so many of the issues we're facing now. The climate crisis that was really came to a head in the 80s, what something could have been done about it. The economic crisis that was launched, I call it Operation Break the Working Class, that literally destroyed the whole path of progress from the Second World War on, that led to so much, you know, people losing their pensions, people living precarious jobs. The housing crisis that we're seeing now, these were all decisions that were launched in the 80s. And of course, the power of big data that, you know, has led to the dystopian disinformation age when we were supposed to be all freed by that. So all these things are happening in the 80s. And yet in our cultural memory, it's this fun and simple time. I argue it was a much darker time. But then having said that, it was also a time where people did incredible acts that changed the world. The ending of apartheid, the Berlin Wall fell without a shot being fired. People have to remember how profound it was that people took to the streets to change the world for the better at that time.
I do remember, though, Ronald Reagan had just been elected president, and one of the first things he did was to fire all the air traffic controllers who conducted an illegal strike. What do you think that did to working people's aspirations at the time?
The Ronald Reagan firing the air traffic controllers was a signal. What had happened initially was the Federal Reserve had decided to massively increase interest rates. So again, 80s redux today. But I mean, they ramped them up to 18 and then 21%. And it wasn't just about beating inflation. It was a stated objective to beat the American working class and the American middle class into believing they weren't going to have continually rising values in wages. And then when Reagan fired those air traffic controllers, it sent a signal across the United States and Canada to start going after the union wages, the benefits, the pensions, the health care, all the things that had built the modern middle class came under attack. And that attack has never really ended.
They gave him the noose, though, Charlie. I mean, it was an illegal strike, and he warned them, if you conduct this illegal strike, we're going to fire you. And they did, and he did.
Well, the thing was, he gave them 48 hours notice. I mean, nobody had ever done anything like that. I mean, we have to go back to the days of robber baron capitalism where something like that was done. And it was about a signal. And after that, we saw a massive full-on assault on union wages. And it happened in Canada, but there was more signs of, there was interesting, and I write about the resistance in Canada. So what you have in the United States at the beginning of 1980s, you have about 25% of the workforce unionized with good pension plans, you know, with vacations. A single parent could send their kids to university. Well, where does that exist now? Now today, you know, the unionized rates in the United States are about 6%. That's lower than it was during the age of the robber barons. In Canada, there was more resistance, and I write about people like Bob White and how
the former head of the Canadian Auto Workers.
The auto workers, yeah, and the auto workers in Canada were very militant at that time, and we pushed back, but we did lose a lot of jobs. I mean, we had the largest job losses since the Depression at the beginning of the 1980s. And yet this was a manufactured crisis. This wasn't something like the Depression. This was literally cooked up by the Federal Reserve, by people like Reagan. It was about breaking the working class.
On balance, I mean, I certainly remember the 80s. AIDS, Chernobyl, which was horrific disaster, nuclear disaster in the former Soviet Union. The threats to nuclear war, certainly the Cold War was at a peak then. But you do say in the book, creativity, hope, community organizing, resistance, that kind of thing. And yet you call it the decade of greed. Why the decade of greed?
It's fascinating because that's what the decade has been called. It's been called, you know, it was, I think, first maybe Time magazine coined it, and that the famous Gordon Gekko, greed is good, from the Wall Street movie. This is the era when, you know, they said Mulroney was the era of Jaguars and condos, and Reagan unleashing, you know, stripping all the protections that were in place for banking and financial sector. So people suddenly started to make enormous amounts of money while other people started to fall through the cracks in a significant way. But in terms of the resistance and in terms of the creativity, you know, I write a lot about Toronto in the early 1980s. I mean, this was this dynamic city where rents were cheap. And, you know, if you went to university, you didn't have to worry about debt so much, because if you dropped out of a course, well, whatever, you get a summer job and you could pay for it. So it was this incredible moment of people, like I write about the music scene, the art scenes, because people could afford to take chances. When I see a young generation, and, you know, my daughters have had to leave Toronto, people who've got good middle-class jobs who can't afford to live here, and almost anywhere, that level of economic pressure, well, where did that begin? So I start tracing through the book a lot of the crisis that we're living today back to these origin moments, and so many of them are in the 1980s.
I do wonder, though, because, you know, I'm trying to imagine if one of your daughters had come up to you and said, Dad, I'm going to quit high school, I'm going to join a punk band, I'm going to try and make it as a musician and basically live hand to mouth for a long time. And I'm wondering what your response to that would have been, because that's what you did.
Yeah, and I write about us quitting school and going on the road and the lessons that we learned. If my daughter said that to me today, I'd beg her not to. But I don't think she would, because a young generation is worried about their future. They're worried about their pensions. They're worried about whether or not they're going to have a job. They're worried about their levels of student debt. They're worried about the planet being in crisis, you know, from the climate fires and what we've been seeing. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I was talking to some young people once, and they said to me, well, you don't know what it's like to live in a world that has no future. And I suddenly thought, I remember being 18 and watching the dangerous escalation in the nuclear arms race. I mean, we almost lost the planet a couple of times. And I write about it. You know, 1983, everyone remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. They don't remember the fact that a couple of times over the fall of 1983, the world almost blew up. And it didn't. And it didn't because so many people just took to the streets, ordinary people, mothers, you know, young activists, they didn't know what else to do. And I think that that's a really powerful lesson for today, is that we are facing planetary crisis, and we can't let these things just disintegrate around us because the stakes are so high.
Let me follow up on that angle, though. I take your point, and you make a compelling case that the peace movement of the day and people going into the streets and saying to Ronald Reagan, we don't want you to put those missiles in Germany, you know, facing the Soviet Union as much as you don't like the Soviet Union. What I didn't see in the book, and I wonder whether you're prepared to acknowledge it, was that a Reagan-esque peace through strength strategy was also part of the mix. It wasn't just Gorbachev's being prepared not to get into an endless arms race that he knew he couldn't win. But peace through strength, at the end of the day, had a role to play in this as well. Would you acknowledge that?
No, absolutely not. I mean, what made Reagan decide to stop the arms race was he saw a TV movie, made-for-TV movie.
Yeah,
you
I know
probably
you say
remember
that. I watched it too. We all did.
I mean, the movie came out in 1983.
The day after.
The day after.
Yeah.
It came out actually at a moment. So it's an accidental confrontation in Eastern Europe that leads to a nuclear holocaust. That movie was playing as that scene was actually starting to play out in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, everybody dies in the end of the movie.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
But and it shocked everybody. But that movie was shown to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the President, which is amazing, a made-for-TV movie. And I think it really shook Reagan up. And as for Gorbachev, What he said made him go to Reykjavik to begin the peace process was he was so inspired by the young women who went to Greenham Common military base. And I remember back in the 80s, they were being laughed at and ridiculed as these crazy women who formed these massive, like 30 and 70,000 people, women, gatherings outside the military bases. And Gorbachev said that it was the determination of those women that made him think there were people on the other side that he could negotiate with. So I think in the end, the peace through strength, that's been the big argument, but it was actually ordinary people. And I do write about in East Germany, like the fascinating role of the punk rock movement that was being beaten and attacked by the Stasi, getting involved with the Lutheran Church protecting the punks in East Germany, and then starting to form this resistance to the communist state. There's a lot of hidden histories, and that's why dangerous memories that aren't told about those times. So I try and go down some of those rabbit holes to sort of say there were a lot of other really interesting things that we just never got taught.
Did you think, though, that when you were playing the punk music back in the day that you were somehow contributing to a movement which, taken to its logical extension, would have a positive impact on the world?
I think one of the things that was really powerful about the 80s was that you felt like things mattered. And so one big thing was apartheid. And I mean, there was no sitting on the sidelines. And the role of artists and musicians at that time, and, you know, Bob Geldof's come in for a lot of criticism, you know, recently over We Are the World, but that was a staggering gathering of people to raise money to respond to the horrific Ethiopian crisis. The apartheid, the boycotts had a huge impact, and so we were a young band. You know, we were nobodies. We were nominated for an award in Toronto. L'Étranger, our punk band, and then we found out that the sponsors had ties in South Africa, and we didn't go to this awards dinner that probably screwed our career in a big way. But that's the way it seemed. It seemed like you had to take sides in the 80s. And I think that in an age where we feel cynical and everybody's on doom scrolling, a lot of artists actually stepped up, and that did make a difference. How much of a difference? I don't know, but it inspired people to feel that they could make a difference.
In your view, what was the most politically influential group of the time?
Well, there was... I think there were so many. I think in the United States, Bruce Springsteen was certainly a voice for, you know, writing about what was happening to the American working class. Politically, The Clash, you know, in England. We played with the Dead Kennedys, but that was a hellhole show, and
you almost got your.
We almost got killed playing for the Dead Kennedys.
You did, yeah.
But again, a lesson from that was like we also saw the rise of fascism, and I'm not saying the Dead Kennedys were fascist, but there was a lot of like what we're seeing now. You know, Proud Boys, a lot of this sort of race anger. Music was used as a form of resistance to bring people together, to bring people across party line or across racial lines. And in Toronto, the Rock Against Racism movement played a huge role in de-escalating racial tension at a time when there was a lot of racial tension. And we forget that Toronto in the 80s did have a lot of racial tension. We forget the horrific violence against the gay community that was almost normalized. And I write about AIDS, and, you know, okay, I was a straight Catholic kid. I didn't know a lot about what was happening then, but those forms of resistance changed things forever. And the first Toronto Pride was an act of resistance against local cops, and now it's like one of the biggest festivals in North America. So there are incredible stories that we can learn from, but there are also lessons we got to learn not to repeat.
You mentioned the biggest groups of the time, the most influential groups. What about a song? What was the most influential song/anthem of the 80s?
Well, I actually did. I did my top 40 Charlie Angus Dangerous. Remember, you can check it out on Spotify. And I picked the #1 song. It was 99 Luftballons.
Oh, yeah,
by Nina, which was such a great dance song. But I picked that song because the whole idea of these 99 balloons crossing over into Russia, into Russian territory, and they see it on the radar
for
screen.
Nuclear weapons.
And it causes this nuclear explosion. That scene was actually playing out when that song was all over the radio. So I said, talk about prescient. Everybody's dancing in the clubs to 99 Luftballons as that scene was actually almost playing out. You have to read the book to know how it almost played out. But again, it's a fascinating thing about the 80s. So much of the politics, so much of the fears, so much of the uncertainties were in the music. They were in the arts, and it was a reflection of that time.
Now, they still play Imagine on New Year's Eve in Times Square by John Lennon. All these years later, whatever it is. How many years? I guess he wrote that in 1980, something like that. So here we are, almost half a century later, and they're still playing it. Did that make your top 40 list?
No, what I did was just Starting Over was the last song John Lennon did just before he was assassinated. And again, John Lennon's assassination, I think, in a sense, kicked the 80s off. It was suddenly we were cut adrift. But, one of the things, we talked a bit earlier about Chernobyl, like things like Chernobyl, the meltdown that happened there, we are seeing the ghosts of the 1980s being played out in the Ukraine war. I mean, Putin, the very first thing he did when he invaded Ukraine was he drove his tank straight to Chernobyl, what was on the road. But, I mean, Chernobyl brought the Soviet Union down. The anger over what had happened in that nuclear catastrophe, the role Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to do glasnost and openness, but they couldn't cover up the devastating impacts. And that was a key element of Ukraine becoming independent. And now we're seeing, like with Putin and the war and the talk of a rising missile crisis now that's happening between the United States and Europe and Ukraine. We're going back into these dark ghosts of the 80s, and I think we gotta be paying attention to how dangerous that is.
I want to play you 20 seconds of a song that you may remember, had something to say about life in this country back in the day. Sheldon, you want to roll this, please?
In Fort Capel came a dapple gray. His children caught blood in the autumn rains. Broke the treaty when the buffalo failed. Fenced the land for the CP rail. There's four horses at the Great Divide.
Now, for those who are listening on podcast and did not see that clip, that's Charlie Angus singing out in a field somewhere. The song
in the Capel Valley in Saskatchewan.
There you go. Four Horses is the name of the song. What's that song about?
That song is about how the treaty that was signed out in the Capel Valley that turned over the land to the Canadian state. And the promise was, because the Cree and the Blackfoot knew the buffalo were disappearing and that they would share the land. And what Canada did was, when the buffalo failed, they cut the food off and starved them and took the land to put the railway through.
You know that's... I know that's what the song's about, and I know you've got that graphic up right off the top, alleging that Sir John A. Macdonald purposefully starved the Indigenous people of the day. You know there is great scholarly controversy about that allegation.
Well, certainly, but many of the people who were involved in that starvation campaign did pretty darn well historically, and I certainly tell people they should read Clearing the Plains by James Dashuk. It's a powerful book. But these are histories we need to confront. And I think we are confronting them. And I will say, again, in a positive sense, is that these were things we were never taught in school. I mean, the punk club that we used to play, The Edge, in Toronto, our favorite place, was the home of Edgerton Ryerson, who's, had a huge role in the residential schools. And we didn't know those histories.
He also created the first free public school system in the province of Ontario.
Yes. And
I'm just saying, both sides of the argument?
But I think we never got to the other side of the argument. We never heard the Indigenous story. We never heard about the starvation. We never heard about Poundmaker and the mass hanging of braves who had just come to the fort to get food, and they sent the army against them. And there would have been a battle much worse for white soldiers than the Little Bighorn. Poundmaker didn't let the soldiers die. We never learned any of those stories. So sometimes songs, and so I wrote that in Four Horses. This is our history, and we need to confront it.
That is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring that up, because you having done both, I'm curious as to what you think actually moves people more: a great political speech or a great political song?
That's a really good question. Here's my my take on it, is that people know if a song's bogus in the first 30 seconds, and that's why songs have to be truthful. And so, you know, if a song is just blah, but songs can change things. I come from the Irish-Scottish tradition. Our history was taught to us in songs. We know all about the perfidy of the English during the famine because of those songs. And I think speeches can do a great deal as well, but I think when we live in the world of slogans and we live in the world of message box, we don't end up with great speeches. So a great song and a great speech, I think, has to come from the heart.
We started with a quote, so let's end with a quote. Here's another one from the book. Sheldon, if you would bring this up, and I'll read out loud for those listening on podcast. There is a hell of a lot of work to do now, writes Charlie Angus. Some of that work will need to be systemic and political. But there is work that can be done in our communities, in building up our own fragile relationships and local ecosystems. Call it climate mutual aid. Call it punk rock time. And so, yes, I am full of both dread and hope. What's the most hopeful lesson you took from the 1980s that could be helpful to us today?
I think is that when you look at something as big as the planet blowing up and not knowing how a single person could make a change, if enough single persons come together, change starts to happen. And that's what I try and write about in the book. That's my hope, is that things seem monolithic and they seem impossible until suddenly they're not. But they only become not impossible if we step up. And so my mutual aid is I think we need to rebuild communities. We need to start reaching out. We got to get off doom scrolling. We live on doom scrolling. We have to rewire our brains to be more open to just going to a public meeting. Does anyone go to public meetings anymore? Well, that's what we used to do, right? Go meet someone. Go talk to someone. We have to start rebuilding community because I think we let too much of that slip.
Dangerous Memory. Coming of age in the decade of greed is Charlie Angus's latest contribution to the library shelves and presumably some bookshelves in people's homes as well. And we thank you for coming into TVO tonight and talking about it.
Thank you so much.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, February 5th, 2025. Tomorrow, what issues are motivating voters in Northern Ontario? We'll look into that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.